good morning, good morning, and welcome to another radical conversation between Rabbi Levi Cunin, who you can see to my right, and Michael E. Gerber, who you can see directly in front of you and speaking to you now. I am, of course, the wandering Jew, and Rabbi Levi Cunin is the practicing Jew. We're having this conversation, and we imagine this conversation to be going on and on and on and on, because, of course, it's a conversation that's been going on for literally thousands of years. Unfortunately, none of you have been participating in it, because, unfortunately, too, the radical Jew, the wandering Jew, and the practicing Jew don't and haven't felt that they have much in common. What we're discovering is that we do. And so I want to introduce you to Rabbi Levi Cunin. Rabbi Cunin will say hello and perhaps start our session this morning. How are you?
Thank God, good to see you, during these such challenging times where the state of our country and of the world is filled with uncertainty. It's as I mentioned every morning, it's doubly grateful to know that we're here, we're alive, we're feeling well. I'm glad to see you, and hoping and praying that this mishigas is done with, pretty soon. While you were saying those few words, I was reminded of a story that I heard from Rabbi Manis Friedman, a dear friend of mine. You know him also. So one time he had a interaction with a secular Jew, and very quickly the secular Jew said, "I want to tell you something, that although we both are called ourselves Jewish, says we can't be more different than you and I." He said, "I'm going to tell you, for example, on Yom Kippur, I make a point to go to a McDonald's and to get myself a ham sandwich. That's how much I demonstrate." To which the rabbi looked at him, Rabbi Friedman, and said, "If you think about it, we're not that different after all. Both of us observe Yom Kippur. You do it in your way, I do it in my way."
And only a practicing Jew could say that.
But I'll tell you,
and it's exactly the same as you said, I believe, in our last session. There is no God. What did you
there's
say?
only one God, we don't believe in him.
There's only one God, we don't believe in him, right? And I said, there's only one God, but I don't know him.
Yeah.
And someone commented to me in between that conversation and the one we're having right now, that was the most meaningful separation between the two of us. You as the practicing Jew and me as the wandering Jew. And I said to her, yes, but it isn't a separation at all. It's what joins us. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. Between our conversations here, you mentioned that you were reading Kabbalah.
Yeah, the Kabbalah. So, yes.
And the thing you said to me, please say it here.
Okay. So one of the points of, and the beautiful gifts of the Torah is the more that we learn the Torah, the more that we water our narrative in our minds to observe the reality that we're in a different way. And that's true about any time we study Torah, because it gives us perspective. Like, for example, one example of something that gives us perspective from Torah is the Torah talks about the responsibility that we have to put a fence around a high space to keep people safe. So there's a law, one of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah is to put a fence around a high area where people walk, so to keep people safe. Now, in that verse in the Torah says, lest the falling person fall. Lest the falling person fall. What's the Torah telling us? What's the point of the falling person? And then in the deeper teachings of Torah, we come to learn that when someone falls or whenever something happens, nothing could have possibly happened to a person if it were not destined. So the people who bring about the people who we consider to be the cause of certain things of our lives, they're really not the cause of it. They're more like the messenger. Sometimes people choose to be a messenger in a negative way, but really, that's why the Torah tells us, lest the falling person falls off, meaning the fact that whoever it is that fell really has nothing to do with the fact that they fell off of your porch, because they would have fallen off of somebody else's porch. That's just the destiny the Torah tells us of. Yet we still play a role in our actions, and we're responsible for a person when we neglect to do what we're responsible for, but we are not the cause of it. The causation is a different conversation. So that's just an example. For me, that's a huge one of the possibility of taking events in our life and putting it through the filter of the Torah, because that one really helps with resentment, by the way.
So regarding everything that occurs as a message from Hashem.
Yes, everything. We once we accept the fact that we can't possibly know the essence of God, we also could accept the fact that there's no limitations to it. It's beyond our mind, but therefore there's an intimate relationship going on with even a leaf that falls off of a tree, with the force that's putting it into being. Nothing could happen to us in our life. This is what they say in Yiddish. You know the word bashert? You may have heard the word bashert. It was meant to be. It's destiny. But really, this is the idea, is that there's a system going on of cause and effect. Just like you have physical cause and effect, you have also spiritual cause and effect. There's a reality to it that's a longer conversation. But the point of it is, the cause of things is not the way we observe them in a natural way. The cause of things is not the way that we observe them in a natural way. And by being able to study more about that, it gives us insight, not just an idea, but actually to connect to a higher conversation, which really relieves us of anger and resentment. So that's just an example of where the Torah's, because just think of it this way. The Baal Shem Tov, who I shared a story with you about yesterday, one of his famous lines is, you are wherever your mind is. Right now, wherever your mind is, that's where you are. That's where we are. Where is our mind? How do we interpret events in front of us? What conversation that's going on in our head? Who's supplying the words and letters and everything for the way that we perceive things? And the reality is that most of it, that which we think we understand, if we just get present and be honest with ourselves, we realize the narrative in our mind is not a true narrative. It's our narrative. It's the way we perceive things. But usually we're not right about the way we perceive things. But then we can replace that narrative. And that's what the Torah provides us. The study of Torah is to replace the narrative, allowing us to be free of the narrative in our minds that's keeping us enslaved to a program that's filled with depression, resentment, and all the other goodies that come along with the type of thinking that's disconnected, which we all have. Because even though someone studies Torah, it doesn't mean they don't fall down into that narrative in their own minds. It's the natural narrative. It's the lower narrative. but the continuous study of Torah, and any one of us can connect to this, it's easy more than ever before. The continuous study of Torah allows us to have a different narrative in our minds.
But let me, and I, I feel I'm disappointing my wandering Jew friends
Okay.
by not providing a forceful enough counter to what you just said and what you continue to say in our conversations. And so my mind goes to yes, but. And that yes, but that my mind goes to reiterates what I said to you either in the 6th of our conversations or the 5th or the 4th, and I don't recall. But I said to you that the story, and I'm calling it the story, that the practicing Jew lives by, the story that is revealed in the Torah, the story that the practicing Jew lives by, then determines what the practicing Jew thinks. And in his highest moments, what he also feels, experiences, relates to, and responds to. Stop me if I'm wrong in any of that.
Well, I would say that ideally, that's the way that it should be. But reality is that even people who are practicing Jews and have all of this information and have all of this conversation that I'm sharing with you available to them, but doesn't necessarily mean they're living within it. That's why you have.
Levi, I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I absolutely agree with it. But I'm speaking about it ideally, and I'm countering it, if you will, ideally, from the wandering Jew's perspective. Now I'm playing the part of the wandering Jew, and I started this conversation just moments ago by saying I'm letting the wandering Jews in our community down by not arguing with you about what you're saying. And understand what you were saying is ideally the practicing Jew would, et cetera, if living the Torah. And I understand that, but in our conversation, you're speaking both from an ideal perspective. The Torah says a practicing Jew is, a practicing Jew does, ideally, if in concert with Torah. I'm countering that by bringing it back to what I shared with you earlier, which is I'm calling it a story. And so you moved me when you described that story, the story of Passover, for example. That story has been alive for 3,300 and whatever years. Every year, there is a Passover, I call it celebration, by the Jewish people. And every year they do that in identically the same way they did it the year before, maintaining, sustaining that message, that story, for all the generations that followed. That when a practicing Jewish family celebrates Passover, which is coming up, practices Passover, they do it according to a ritual that is specified in Torah and that has been specified by all practicing Jews. So therefore, living the story as the story's been told. And I'm raising the, not argument, because we're not arguing here, but raising the thought, the position, the idea that it still is a story.
It's still what?
It still is a story. It's a story that you, a truly practicing Jew, tell continuously, year after year after year after year after year after year. And so in that way, I'm suggesting, from a wandering Jew's perspective, that that's a very old story. And why is it then that we continue to tell it as memorized, as it is memorized, as it has been spoken by every one of your practicing Jews' peers for thousands of years? And here we are in this new age called 2020, where what you're speaking about is considered to be just a story. Now hear me, I say just a story, like all stories. However poignant they are, however moving they are, however true they might be, they're still just a story. What's not just a story is what happened to me this morning before I came on this call. What's not just a story is what's going to happen to me after this call. In fact, what's not just a story is what's happening to us right now. And that may be called reality. So that's a lot to address in a 20-minute conversation.
I do want to say that something I mentioned the other day in that conversation about the fact that it was an unbroken chain for 3,300 plus years.
Yes.
The point over here, just from a very logical perspective, just to move away from everything else, just from a logical, to there's this common sense, right? So common sense is, how do we know that there was something, that the events of history that people tell, how do we know that they happened? And the truth is, much of that which is told in history books, they're very different. We know that the winner of the war gets to write the history book. So what do we really know about that, right? But then there are certain times that there's something actually the Torah talks about, times that there are times that you have to have witnesses, you have to have testimony. What constitutes true testament? What constitutes true testimony? That it's not just a story, but it's a real story. That's not just a legendary story, it's a real story, and it's our story, and it's not a story of the past. It's a story that we're reconnecting to, because why is that story so important? It's so important because it was the time in our history that we got to see the truth of our universe. We got to see the presence of the divine in physical matter in a way that's not describable, but one could accept and say, wow, how big that would be if we had that moment. Think and consider about the following. The coal miner goes into the coal mine, and without being connected to the oxygen outside of the coal mine, has no chance to survive in the coal mine. Our stories, the story of Passover, can be seen, and especially as it's told in the esoteric, the mystical, the Hasidic understanding of the story, where it's not just a history, but it's a story about who we are now, the internal enslavement that we are in right now, the exile, the concealment, the distance, the disconnect, and the true freedom that occurs when our eyes open up to see what's really going on. So that is what we connect with every year. Number one, to the actual true story, which is why we eat the matzah. All of this, if you think about it, consider the power of testimony. You see, it's pretty amazing that these matters anchored in the story, that it wasn't just a story, that nobody would ever, but nobody would be able to argue against it if they truly took these factors involved, the fact that you have all these different pieces of the puzzle. So that's the power of the past, and the power of the past as it relates to the present, to the now. And every year, Passover time, which is where we are now, is we're called upon to identify where we're enslaved within us. To which emotions are we enslaved to? Some people are enslaved to their anger. Some people are enslaved to other emotions. And that's a slavery. It's an internal slavery. And on Passover, we're reminded that there's something within us that allows us to be free of that. It's a spark that's not limited to the way we tell our own story. We could be free. We should be free. And God willing, we'll use this Passover to do that in the most profound of ways.
So thank you for that, Levi. I'm, in one respect, remembering the Passover dinners that we had in my family with my father and my mother, brother and sisters, and no one ever spoke about it the way you just did. Now, given that I'm not privy to a Passover dinner as a practicing Jew would have it, meaning ours was a mere shell of what I imagine a practicing Jew would experience in your Passover. What you just spoke of, in my mind, isn't spoken of at your Passover dinner, during Passover, or is it?
Absolutely. That's the depth of Passover, is to relive the freedom. And the details of this slavery and freedom, you could look on Chabad.org, you'll find the spiritual understanding, every detail of the Passover. Like, for example, the matzah, flour and water, it cannot rise. If it rises, that means it became chametz, you can't eat it on Passover. So the matzah has the same ingredients as bread. The difference between them is the bread gets inflated. The matzah represents humility. And that's why it can't rise, because the rising of something is also indicative of when our ego gets inflated. In order for us to have the possibility of being free from that which we're limited to, we have to start with humility. Because as long as we come with an inflated ego, it's impossible to be free of the self, of those characteristics. So that's just a small idea of how the actual Seder plate that we eat on Passover relate to this idea of freedom that is not something of the past, but we yearn for to be freed in the present from the distant state of being, from the concealment state of being, to that which is much higher and much more powerful within us.
But what I'm asking you, and perhaps you're answering it, but I'm not hearing it. But what I'm asking you is the difference between the symbol that the matzah represents, symbolically represents,
Mhm.
and the conversation we're having right now. In short, do you have that conversation? Not symbolically, but actually,
Yes,
about freedom, about the
absolutely,
freedom from.
absolutely.
And is that a conversation at the Passover dinner, at the Passover, in the week that Passover is lived? Is that a conversation between you and your family, your neighbors, your other practicing Jews? Is that a conversation you have? Or is that inferred from the, I'll call, tools of the Passover, the matzah being one?
So the answer is it's absolutely the Haggadah. And by the way, we're running over time, so just so you know.
Okay.
The Haggadah itself, if you look at which is what we read at the Seder table, is filled with this conversation.
I got it.
And
We've got to go. We've got to go, Levi. I'm sorry. We have to go. Have a absolutely extraordinary day, and I'll speak to you in the morning. Bye-bye.
Got it.